Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Patrick Earle. I'm the Executive Director of the Diplomacy Training Programme, one of your hosts for today's webinar, together with the Australian National Contact Point for the OECD Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises, on Responsible Business Conduct. The Diplomacy Training Programme is an NGO affiliated with the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales. We are on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, recognising that they had never ceded their lands and that their struggle for self-determination and for recognition continues today, and it's very relevant to the discussion we'll be having today. The Diplomacy Training Programme has had a focus for the last 35 years on building the knowledge, skills and networks of people working for human rights in different countries and different contexts. We've had a particular focus on business and human rights for the last 20 years, recognising that both governments and business have responsibilities towards human rights. So it's a real honour for us today to co-host this webinar with the National Contact Point and to be joined by such wonderful speakers, and to acknowledge that we have DTP trainers and we have DTP alumni leading today's discussions. It's an honour and privilege for me then to pass on to our moderator for today, Serena Lillywhite. So Serena, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And yes, indeed, welcome to everybody. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land of which we're meeting. Today, I'm joining you from the lands of the Yuin peoples, and in particular, the Wathera Gadals and Wallagadams people of the Bermagui area on the south coast of New South Wales, Australia. And I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to the Aboriginal people present here today. And I also acknowledge these lands and territories were never ceded. So a very warm welcome to all of our participants who've joined this webinar. We had in excess of 200 people registering, which I think, is indicative of the interest in today's topic. This is, in fact, the third webinar in this series that's been jointly delivered by the Australian National Contact Point for the OECD Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct and the Diplomacy Training Programme. And the previous two seminars, and perhaps Kai, if you could just pop that slide up. The first seminar that was held was really an introduction to the OECD Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct and what exactly they are. That was held in February of this year. And the second webinar focused specifically on the guidelines and their applicability to promoting human rights through supply chains. And today's topic on Indigenous peoples' rights, free, prior and informed consent, and the OECD guidelines is no less important, and arguably even more important, certainly for many of our participants here. So today we're really going to be focused on the importance of the OECD guidelines to ensure that Australian companies respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, and especially their right to free, prior and informed consent, or FPIC, as we'll use that terminology today, and its applicability in both Australia and internationally. And indeed, it's great to see participants from a range of countries in our region, from Indonesia, Pakistan, Thailand, Fiji, and many others. So that's really great. It's well documented that extractive industries in Australia and globally are at particular risk of at times negatively impacting Indigenous peoples' rights and their right to self-determination on their lands and territories, and also with regards to respect for their sacred sites and sites of cultural importance. Previously, just by way of a quick recap of the guidelines and what's been delivered in the past. And this is sort of those of you who may have attended the previous two seminars, the slide you see there is really what John Sutherland, who has presented on the guidelines in the past. But just quickly to remind people that these guidelines are a non-judicial mechanism. So they're not, you don't need lawyers necessarily to use the complaint mechanism. The fact they have a complaint mechanism is one of the unique features of these guidelines. They've been agreed to and adopted by all OECD member and adhering governments, and they apply to companies operating in or from OECD member and adhering countries. So, for example, they apply to companies from abroad operating in Australia and equally to Australian companies operating overseas. So we have three fantastic speakers for you today. Frederick Wilson, an Indigenous leader from Sabah in Malaysia. Abby Shillingford, a very proud Indigenous woman from Western Australia. And John Sutherland, one of the independent examiners with the Australian National Contact Point. And there are more details on their bios that you would have received in the brochure that was sent out to promote this program. So each speaker is going to provide a short presentation, and then we'll have a reflection from Frederick in terms of what he's heard from the other speakers and how that translates to what he's seen happening on the ground. Just a heads up, Abby, there in her high-vis uniform, very appropriate for today's webinar, does have to leave early, and we're very grateful she could be here. So we will take questions for her on notice that she can follow up with afterwards if other speakers are not able to answer appropriately for her. You can use the chat function, and I can see that's up and running already, so that's really fantastic. So you can use that chat function to raise questions. We'll monitor those questions and then draw on those questions in our Q&A session after the three presentations. When you're posing those questions, if you could just, if there is a particular person you would like to answer the question, do put that in there. If you could put yourself on mute, that would be fabulous, but we'd love it if you could leave your video on. It just makes it so much nicer for our speakers to know there is a room of real people out there. And in the chat room, we'll be posting relevant links and resources as we go, and that will be added to as a sort of a summary document of this webinar after the event. Okay, I think that's enough from me for now. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Frederick Wilson, to give us a brief overview of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and FPIC. Frederick is, among other things, the Regional Program Officer for the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, Human Rights and Advocacy Program, and his work is fiercely focused on empowering human rights defenders in Indigenous communities in their efforts to tackle business and human rights violations and to ensure their self-determination in decision-making. So, Frederick, I'll put myself on mute and over to you, Frederick.
Thank you so much, Serena. Can you hear my voice clear?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. And can everybody see Frederick?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Kapisanangan. This is my greeting from Indigenous Dusun, from Sabah, Malaysia. And it's really a privilege to be part of this discussion. And I think it's more important for us here is really to share our experience, definitely from the ground level, as well as what we have seen so far at the regional level. I work with the Asia Indigenous People PEC as Indigenous People organization movement in Asia across 14 countries. And this is one of the major topic or even concerns that we always discuss, which is the free, prior, informed consent. If you can go to the next slide, please. So when we advocate, even among indigenous peoples, our communities, in different avenue, this is always our reminder, not only for ourselves, but also for the state or the enterprise or other stakeholders, even among different NGOs, which is for indigenous peoples. We have, this is one of the important foundation for us. The UN General Assembly adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, which is September 2007. So we have seen a lot of the discussion and even emerge different initiative, mechanism, processes. But what we really remind ourselves, even in our own advocacy parties, this is our foundation, which is most of the country, let's say in ASEAN and globally, is supported or vote in favor on this declaration. Meaning to say, this is really a foundation for us to advocate. Either we go to the discourse of business and human rights, or even if we wanted to access the OECD mechanism or other kind of mechanism, or even through the special rapporteur. I think this is very important for us to aware with. If you go to the next slide, please. Yes, and another part is also, which is important for us to refer, is ILO Convention 169. I think there's a typo in the title. So this is the ILO 169. It is only a binding international treaty that really important for recognize the right of indigenous people and tribal people. Because there's a few points that very important here, which is it set the standard only for a land rights, consultation, participation, self-determination, and non-discrimination. So all this component is really important for us. We always talk about our consultation, genuine, inclusive participation, a meaningful participation, and also realizing or recognizing our self-determination in the issue of non-discrimination. And as of 2025, we see only 24 countries have ratified this, but mostly in Latin America and Europe. Next. And in Asia, we only see Asia Pacific is unfortunately only Nepal has ratified. And we also see this is one of the good foundation for our Nepal country to exercise. Even they can challenge or bring this um, ratification in the court level whenever there's a issue around the FPIC, issue around the lack of participation of indigenous peoples. Well, in other country, let's say in Asia, I think what the role of civil society, even indigenous peoples, other stakeholders, is that to advocate, even to tell the states or the government's agency, which is if you can ratify this, this is also can benefit to whole society, because this is not only about the indigenous people, but the whole community itself. Next. And while we are talking with the UNDRIP, we have several articles, but I think in this discussion, I would like to highlight two, which is the right to self-determination and the right to free, prior, informed, and consent. The one that we always remind to our community or indigenous peoples. The UNDRIP itself is written in English and also long article. But at least we should know these two components, because this is the major component that our foundation to advocate our rights, which is the right to self-determination, right to free, prior, informed, and consent, and without expecting the recognition from others, because this is already right within us as a community. Next. And what is actually FPIC? So we discussed a lot, like we want FPIC, community, we want FPIC. But what does that mean about? For us, we see the FPIC is the relation and level of engagement of indigenous people with outside entities. That is basically it first. But also it's now emerged the importance of the FPIC within the community itself, or even how between community have a better relation to collaborate, to work together as a community to govern the territories. And it's also really essential component to govern the right to land, territory, and resources, but also the integration of cultural integrity. I think this is also important for us. Next. And also another part also we see the importance of FPIC is because we experience a lot of systematic exploitation, discrimination, and oppression through violation of the right to our territories or our land or cultural dignity and self-governance. And we also see or even insisted by the indigenous people to introduce this in the customary institution law, right? So because this is also the connection between how the social justice and collective rights among the different community, and this is need to be exercised. Next. And I think 3 points that also we wanted to highlight here, which is the FPIC is always we refer as our rights, but also one of the process and mechanism. And this is need to be clear that this is not something that one-time process or even left one of this, because we see some of the department of state, they only use PIC, which is prior informed consent, without free. So that means there's a space for manipulation, right? So that's why we see that this is continued process from the start, during, and afterward as one of the mechanism. Next. And I think the FPIC is the specific right for indigenous peoples and recognized in the international law and, also the declaration. And this is something that we still have this ongoing discussion around the combination between the indigenous people and local community, because this is something that we need to continue discuss. This is actually really separate rights. The FPIC is really specific right for indigenous people, and it's already recognized by the international law and the declaration. Next. And just to briefly to go through what is that means for us. As I said, without this free, there's an absence or implied absence of any manipulation or intimidation, and also implies absence of external influence that hinder self-determination. While prior, next, and this is the related to the right to undertake the decision-making process. And we always emphasize or even advocate before the start of the project or any kind of activity or program implementation. This should be started within the community itself, and it should not be one leader of indigenous people, for example, but the inclusion of different community. It will be indigenous leaders. It can be youths, women, a person with disability, and how this woman participation also crucial whenever we have this discussion. Next. And inform is basically, this is the right to, can you go back? Yeah. The inform, this is actually the right to sufficient information for decision making. So when we talk about the inform, usually or most of the information that indigenous people community experiences, the information is only written in the national language sometimes, or even difficult part is only written in English, right? There's no accessibility or localized context in that way, because we need to also sensitive with community wherever they belong to. Right? I think we need to be explain that properly. We should enough time and proper disclose, share with the affected community with enough time, manner, and with the appropriate language. And they should be have the freedom to seek additional information as well. Next. And the final part that I would like to share this component is the consent. So the first three element is actually free, prior, informed consent is actually to explain the set of condition for the consent. So sometimes whenever we experience about the consultation, or let's say always the businesses or enterprises use, we have a kind of consultation 1 or 2 times. But for them, the consultation is only to ensure there is yes. But this is actually the space for us, Indigenous people and community, to have kind of proper discussion and independent space to the community to have a proper space for them to consult each other. After that, they have a space to ongoing their own process of decision making, and there's space to revisit the idea in case any project discussed in certain community. So yeah, let me end here, Serena, and I can come back to you later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And just a reminder for everybody to keep an eye on the chat room. As you'll see, there have been other comments of other conventions and treaties that are relevant as well with regards to self-determination. So now let me introduce our second speaker, Abby Shillingford. Abby is a proud Nagaluma Yinjibundi woman from Western Australia. Abby is a legal practitioner with more than 10 years experience in native title. And now she's working with Genesis Minerals Limited as Manager of Heritage and Native Title. And Abby's going to speak to you with her experience on FPIC and just why and how companies should be respecting it, and also some of the challenges that can arise. So over to you, Abby.
Thank you, Serena, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I do apologise in advance for the background noise, as I'm currently dialing in from a mine site, so the door keeps slamming, and I hope that's not going to interrupt too badly. So I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Ngambri people in the Goldfields region of Western Australia. But before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about myself to help frame the perspective that I'm bringing to this conversation today. So as Serena mentioned, I'm a traditional owner. I'm from the Pilbara. I'm a proud Nulama and Yinjibundi woman, where mining has long shaped the landscape, both physically and socially, for my country. My community in Rowan is faced with the challenges of resource development and has been for decades. So for example, today we're navigating the impacts of a proposed lithium mine, which is just 5 kilometres from town. Nearby in Karratha, we live alongside a major gas operation, which is situated on the doorstep of one of the world's oldest and most significant Aboriginal cultural heritage places, the Burrup Peninsula. And that, excitingly, and for a long time coming, has been recently recognised with the World Heritage listing. This experience isn't just personal for me, it's professional. As mentioned, I'm a native title lawyer, and I'm currently the manager of heritage and native title for a mining company. My work is at the intersection of law and culture and the development, where I advocate for respectful engagement, ethical agreement making, and protection of country and culture. So it's from this place of my lived experience and my legal experience and the industry insight that I speak to you today about the importance of free, prior, and informed consent, and how we can shape a more inclusive and accountable future for resource development here in WA. Next slide, please. As you can all appreciate, mining remains central to Australia's economy, but its future depends on aligning with social licence, environmental responsibility, and cultural integrity. While FPIC is a key international standard affirming Indigenous rights, it is not yet embedded in Australian law. Instead, mechanisms like the Native Title Act and the right to negotiate fall short of requiring actual consent, allowing projects to proceed even without traditional owner agreement. This legal gap creates challenges for mining companies who must navigate the rising expectations from communities, investors, and global standards. So the absence of a clear FPIC requirement, it leads to inconsistent practices and reputational risk. However, genuine consent, it's complex and it requires time, culturally respectful engagement, and recognition of Indigenous governance. However, despite these challenges, many mining companies are voluntarily adopting FPIC principles as part of our ESG commitments. And by integrating FPIC into early engagement and co-designing of agreements, we support cultural governance, and proponents can then establish trust, reduce conflict, and deliver lasting benefits for both communities and for the project. Next slide, please. In the Australian legal context, where I refer to traditional owners, I am referring to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, those who have been formally recognised under the Native Title Act as having native title rights and interests over their land and waters, but what has been recognised formally by the Federal Court. It's under the Native Title Act that traditional owners may have that right to negotiate with the mining companies for the development of projects on their land. However, this does not guarantee FPIC. The right to negotiate, it's merely procedural, and it can result in agreements being imposed, even if the traditional owners do not consent. So FPIC, by contrast, it's a rights-based standard that requires genuine, voluntary, and informed consent before any project proceeds. It affirms the authority of traditional owners to say yes or no to a proposal. So while the Native Title Act provides mechanism for consultation and negotiation, it does fall short of requiring FPIC in the way that international standards like the UN DRIP or IRMA do. Currently in Western Australia, FPIC is only seen as a best practice. It's not legally mandated under our current legislation. And if companies still want to proceed with their projects under that specific legislation, they can, even without the full consent of the people. Next slide, please. So in practice, FPIC is often sidelined due to a legal ambiguity, costs and timeline pressures, power imbalances, or misrepresentation of its purpose. Although the OECD guidelines call for meaningful engagement with Indigenous people, a gap remains between principle and practice. Bridging this gap, it requires more than just policy. It demands a cultural shift where Indigenous engagement is treated as a strategic and ethical priority and not just as a compliance task. Next slide, thanks. In the context of agreement making between mining companies and traditional owners, some companies are beginning to shift from a transactional engagement to a more meaningful rights-based practice. Progressive companies are demonstrating this shift through several key approaches: engaging early and consistently throughout the whole entire project lifecycle, building long-term relationships based on trust and transparency, supporting capacity building with traditional owner groups, embedding FPIC into internal governance and decision-making frameworks, and recognising cultural authority and respecting Indigenous governance structures. Next slide, please. Across Western Australia, the shift in dynamics is not just corporate goodwill. It reflects traditional owners increasingly asserting their authority in the negotiations. Legal recognition of native title and cultural heritage is now being reinforced by practical leverage and with communities strategically influencing the project outcomes. When rights are undermined, traditional owners may withhold heritage surveys, decline agreements, or actually disengage from the project approvals. These are all actions that create delays to the project, operational uncertainty, and reputational risk for the mining company. These disruptions can stall permits, inflate costs, and affect the investor confidence, which ultimately will impact the shareholder value. This reinforces that FPIC, not as a procedural formality, but as a strategic and ethical imperative. So it's no surprise that companies who embed FPIC through early engagement and co-designed agreements will be better positioned to build the trust, secure the social license, and navigate regulatory processes. This shift is reflectively growing in the alignment with the global standards and the soft law norms, where investor expectations and reputational considerations increasingly shape corporate behaviour. So FPIC, it should no longer be optional. It is central to the legitimacy, sustainability, and for our reconciliation. Next slide, please. A prominent example of FPIC failure is the long-running dispute between Indigenous Peoples and Fortescue Metals Group. Despite the Indigenous holding exclusive native title rights, FMG commenced mining operations in 2013 without securing an Indigenous land use agreement. Instead of engaging with the recognised native title holders, FMG negotiated with the Willamara Indigenous Aboriginal Corporation. That's a breakaway group. And this caused division amongst the community. This case highlights the consequences of bypassing genuine consent, causing cultural harm, legal challenges, and reputational damage. It underscores the need for companies to respect Indigenous governance structures and embed FPIC into the engagement processes, not just as a best practice, but as a strategic and ethical imperative. Next slide. Fortescue's failure to secure FPIC from the Indigenous people led to the reported destruction of over 285 sacred sites, causing deep cultural harm and community division. This case highlights the risk of bypassing the genuine consent. It is essential that FPIC is legitimate and sustainable, and that the consent must come from the recognised representatives through early, transparent, and culturally appropriate engagement. Because native title alone does not guarantee protection, and compensation cannot restore the cultural loss. So Australia's legislative framework, it must shift from the procedural compliance to genuine consent, because currently under the Native Title Act Future Acts regime, projects can proceed without the explicit agreement, creating an impression of consent, and however failing to meet our FPIC standards. Next slide. In May 2020, Rio Tinto legally destroyed 2 ancient rock shelters at Juukan Gorge in the Pilbara region. These sites are of cultural and spiritual significance to the PKKP people. This destruction carried out under Section 18 of the Aboriginal Heritage Act. For those that don't know what that means, it is a legal pathway to apply for consent to the minister to impact a heritage site with or without conditions being imposed at the minister's discretion. This sparked national and international outrage, becoming a defining moment in the conversation around Indigenous rights and heritage protection. This incident exposed deep systemic flaws in Australia's cultural heritage and native title frameworks, demonstrating that legal compliance does not guarantee ethical conduct or the protection of Indigenous values. Juukan Gorge became a symbol of the failure to uphold FPIC. It highlighted the urgent need to align Australian law with international standards, such as the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the OECD Guidelines. Next, please. The Juukan Gorge incident and similar cases have highlighted the critical gap in Australia's legal and regulatory frameworks. These include the absence of genuine FPIC under the Native Title Act's Future Acts regime, heritage laws that permit approvals even when traditional owners object, including for sacred sites, and corporate and regulatory shortcomings in governance, transparency, and accountability. While there's been some progress, such as increased industry awareness and voluntary alignment with international standards, these efforts remain uneven. Comprehensive reform is needed to embed Indigenous rights into law and practice. This includes stronger legal protections, enforceable consent processes, and a genuine co-design with traditional owners to prevent further cultural loss and ensure respectful right-based engagement. Next slide. As expectations around ethical resource development continue to rise, mining companies are increasingly being held accountable, not just for environmental performance, but also for how they engage with Indigenous communities and protect our cultural heritage. In response, global standards such as the IRMA and the OECD Guidelines are playing a growing role in shaping industry's behaviour, including in Western Australia, where mining intersects closely with Indigenous land and heritage. IRMA offers a rigorous and transparent ESG framework for responsible mining with explicit requirements of FPIC, cultural heritage protection, and community engagement. Its adoption by operations like the Greenbushes lithium mine reflects a broader industry shift towards greater transparency and accountability, and importantly, the inclusion of traditional owners in decision-making processes. Similarly, the OECD guidelines encourage companies to go beyond the minimum legal requirements by promoting meaningful engagement and recommending the pursuit of FPIC wherever Indigenous peoples are affected, even in jurisdictions where it is not legally mandated. These standards collectively reinforce the importance of ethical conduct, shared governance, and respect for Indigenous rights in agreement making and the project development. They also signal a move towards embedding Indigenous perspectives into the core of responsible mining practices, rather than treating them as peripheral considerations. Next, please. In closing, mining proponents and traditional owners can coexist in development when engagement is grounded in respect, transparency, and shared decision-making. Increasingly, companies are recognising that ethical resource development is not only possible, but more sustainable when traditional owners are treated as equal partners in the process. By embedding FPIC principles, supporting cultural governance, and co-designing agreements that truly reflect Indigenous values and aspirations, proponents can then build trust, reduce conflict, and unlock long-term benefits for both community and the project development. Coexistence is not about compromise. It's about collaboration where development respects country, culture, and community. Thank you all for listening to me. And if you have any questions, please send them through. I'd love to stay on further, but I have to take off and catch a flight. But thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Abby, and I appreciate those emoji claps that are going up to thank you for your participation today. And yes, any specific questions for Abby, please put them in the chat and we'll get those forwarded, and DTP will facilitate her responses. Just before we go to the next speaker, I'd also just like to acknowledge Les Malaza, who is with us today as a participant. Les has been putting some incredibly useful information in the chat function, but I would also, really like to acknowledge the critical role that Les played in the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and really his decades of leadership in this whole area of self-determination and FPIC in particular. So Les, it's lovely to have you with us, and thank you for your active participation and sharing of your knowledge through the chat function. And this brings me now to our final speaker, and then we'll circle back to Frederick. So John Sutherland is a mediator, lawyer, and academic based in Perth. And importantly for our discussion today, he's one of the independent examiners with the Australian National Contact Point. So when cases come before the Australian National Contact Point, John could be one of the examiners that looks at that particular case. And he's going to share with you now some of his cases he's been involved in as an examiner that have impacted specifically on Indigenous peoples, and looking at both cases in Australia, but also a quick summary of some cases of Australian companies operating overseas. So John, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. And what an honour to be speaking here with the other very experienced speakers in this area. As Serena said, I'm in the southwest of Australia on Whadjuk Whadjuk or Noongar country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present from here, and also acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands of everyone in today's meeting. And it's been interesting looking at the chat and looking at the discussion from Les and Frederick and others about the importance and these international standards and what they expect or oblige or require of government. That's really important. I guess the thing we're looking at here is how do they also apply to companies? So if we can go to the next slide, please, Kaya. You'll remember from last time, so the key document is this thing, the OECD Guidelines, and the two other useful documents that I pointed to that are produced there. The OECD has produced a document talking about how does due diligence work. So yes, we have these human rights standards. What does that mean for companies? What do they have to do to ensure respect for human rights in their operations, in their supply chains? And then the other document, the second one from the left there, you see is the procedure for how the Australian National Contact Point deals with complaints. So there are three documents. On the right, and I'll refer to it a couple of times, is a website and some useful materials from a non-government organisation called OECD Watch. And they have some really useful ideas of strategy and thinking about is a complaint useful? How would that work? So that's a reminder of where we were last time. Kaya, if we could have the next slide. There's two more documents I'd add to that. The first is buried up the back of a guide that talks about how due diligence is expected of in the extractive sector, so mining, oil and gas. Up the back of that, they have an annex about engaging with Indigenous people. And this really unpacks the guidelines and how they work and what their expectations are for companies. So that's a very useful document to use. And then the second one, if we do one more click, Kaya, thanks. There's a guide that the OECD put out for how national contact points should be dealing when a complaint or a specific instance comes in relation to a company dealing with Indigenous issues or Indigenous people. So they're two other documents that I think are quite useful from there. The slides that I make available later through the DTP, I've built in there. If you click on that, it will go through to the document. So if we could go to the next slide, please. As Serena said, I'm going to talk about a couple of cases because I think that's the best way to understand how does this work. I'll be looking at 4 cases that the Australian National Contact Point has dealt with and picking up different examples. So some of these are international companies or connections where the impact has occurred in Australia. So how do the guidelines relate to that? And 2 of them are cases of Australian companies and proposals or plans or operations overseas. And that's really important. I saw in the earlier chat, people are saying, well, what happens, if a government isn't meeting its international obligations? This is a way of saying, well, a company can't just say, oh, we're meeting all the domestic law. And as Abby had good examples as well, company can't just say, oh, we meet the relevant law, we don't have to do anything more. The guidelines say if the relevant law isn't following the international standards, you do. So let's have a look at a couple of these cases. Perhaps the next slide. Now, sorry, some of these are a little bit text heavy, and I won't stop on every point, but I guess on each of them, you'll see some bits in red. These are the key things I think you should get out of that. And with each slide, you'll see a link which will go through to the actual document, the statement of the National Contact Point. So this one is a case some years ago, an Australian company, and about impacts in Colombia in a coal mine there. It went into mediation and there was an agreed outcome. And I guess the 2 points that I think are useful, you can look at this as a precedent. As part of that process, there was an independent review. So after the complaint was lodged, the company agreed and funded and set up an independent review. So that's a useful precedent process to know about. And the agreement also saw the company making contributions, funding further sustainable projects. So as I said, if you click on the link, you can get that. And I'm happy to talk about these more in Q&A, but just quickly for the process here, if we go to the next slide, just jumping through these cases. This second one is, this one's an impact in Australia, and some Indigenous men raised concerns about electrical infrastructure and energy that was being built and had some impact on heritage aspects. And again, you see the statements there, and what I've done, where I've given a bit of a summary, I've also put in the paragraph. Some of these statements are very long, but to help you find the key bits. And the three things I think are very useful from this is it reinforced these standards include UNDRIP. So companies have to understand UNDRIP. Companies have to be building into their due diligence, into their respect for human rights. What does UNDRIP involve? And FPIC as part of that. The second point there that I've said before, and it's said in a number of these cases, it's in the guidelines and it's reinforced in these cases, that just holding up a domestic law and saying we're compliant with this domestic law, that does not ensure that you're acting consistently with the guidelines. And then the last point in red there, you'll see there, the outcome of this was the company didn't want to engage in the process, and also that it wasn't evident how they had met or acted consistently with the guidelines. And so the statement at the end said, well, that the company has not been consistent with the guidelines because it wasn't apparent they had a grievance mechanism appropriate to deal with this, and they didn't engage through the AusNCP process. So they're, I think, three interesting points from that one. Perhaps if we could go to the next slide. This is a more recent case, this one an Australian company, and it's about operations or plans and proposals in Papua New Guinea. And I should say, you see right at the bottom of this is currently in a follow-up process. So what often happens with NCPs, they'll make a statement, make recommendations, and say, we'll follow up in 12 months' time to see what's happening with these. That's currently in that process. So I'll be very careful. I'm just talking about what the final statement said some years ago. And you'll see again in the red, I think the important and the useful things to get out of this is that, again, it reinforced free prior informed consent. Where there are significant impacts that are going to occur on a group, free prior informed consent is required of the company. This isn't just talking about the government. And also that can't be mitigated. You can't say, oh, we'll compensate and that will ensure we've met the relevant standards. It said, no, if free prior informed consent is required, it's required. And then the next one down, and I've put in that paragraph, you see 84, and it unpacks a lot better, but I've just summarized it here. In some of the international standards, there's discussion sometimes to say, well, a government sometimes it might be in a position of securing broader human rights for a population, and how is that balanced with individual rights of a group? And there's certainly some international standards that say at times the state can make that balancing. But the guidelines, and they're similar with the IFC, the World Bank standards, say that is not a path that is available to a company. A company cannot say, oh, we're helping with broader human rights, our project will benefit that, therefore we don't need free prior informed consent there. That would not be consistent with the guidelines. We go to the next one, and apologies, as I said, I'm going very quickly, but I just want to pick up some key points and we can discuss further in the Q&A. This is a very recent, if you haven't heard of this, that's not surprising. This statement's only about 2 weeks old. and it's about the use of military equipment produced by a Swedish company and impacts on Indigenous heritage or concerns about Indigenous heritage impacts in Australia. And I guess there's much in there. The point I touch on, you see in the red at the bottom, is that it's this question of, even if you haven't caused or contributed an impact yourself, but you are linked to it, and here it's linked because of the way the government use this material, that's still a link. And that's a link that a company needs to use its influence, use its leverage to try and get the other party to prevent, to mitigate, to remediate. So 4 very quick cases from the AusNCP, and if we can go to the next slide, I just wanted to note 4 other cases that different national contact points have picked up. Some of the points are similar, but again, you'll see some of these are, many of them are European contact points, some of them about impacts in Europe, some of them are European companies and impacts elsewhere. If we could go to the next slide. This is the Norwegian contact point about a Norwegian company and a nickel proposal and development in the Philippines. And you can see at the bottom there, I'd say, and this is what the Norwegian contact point said, you can't just say, oh, we've got agreement with some groups and they're fine with it. If there's, in this case, I think it was infrastructure and other Indigenous groups further away, not in the actual mine site itself, they are being impacted and there wasn't appropriate engagement with that. So that was one thing the Norwegian contact point picked up. Next again, please. Thanks, Kaya. So this is a Shell impacts operations in Nigeria through a subsidiary. And you see there in the red at the bottom, I think a useful point out of this statement was it said, you might have a large multinational, they also need to be thinking about leverage and influence. And the quote there, to ensure their subsidiaries full compliance with the guidelines and the UN guiding principles. A useful precedent, I think, to keep in mind, and companies need to understand that. They can't just say, oh, that's further down the line, we don't have complete control over that. Next slide, and apologies, I'm running through these quickly, but I think there's just a couple of key points. This one's a Swiss contact point decision in relation to a renewable project in Norway. And out of the mediation, there was agreement in this. So it's quite a useful one to look at, I think, to encourage companies to say, well, here's some agreement in there. The company, as you can see, said, well, they need to do some revision and some changes in their policies and procedures, bringing in integrating respect for human rights, including FPIC, referring to that, and that we will expect this of our partners and build it into their contracting. The last one is very quick. It's a recent outcome from the German contact point, and I'll leave the details there. And we can have 2 more slides. If we can go to the next, I just want to, I guess, say some general what are the key things I'd recommend you take out of that. One, I don't want to give the impression that everything is perfect and resolves. So there are a number of cases where Indigenous groups and representatives, those working with them, have through the process said, well, this is not going where we want to, and sometimes they withdraw. Be aware of the national contact point you're dealing with. Some contact points will continue with the case and can make recommendations. Others that may end in well, that the process ends there and there'll be no observations about the company. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The last point you see there, if you pick up the guidelines, I don't think it uses the phrase FPIC, but it does say companies need to respect human rights. They need to do that human rights due diligence, and that includes human rights standards like UNDRIP, and therefore that's where we get that concept of FPIC coming in. And one more slide, and then I'll be quiet. The key things I really want people to take away and use from this. So, firstly, that point I said earlier, it's understood that the guidelines expectations bring in UNDRIP, they bring in the concept of FPIC. And so they say that, or they essentially expect of companies, they need to be engaging with Indigenous parties that are affected by their proposals or their decisions or their actions. And again, I just refer you back to that due diligence guide from 2017. There's some useful explanation of how that occurs, how that should occur. If Indigenous parties have concerns about a company, I'd certainly say the first thing, the expectation is talk to that company first, because that's what the guidelines expect of companies. There needs to be meaningful engagement with stakeholders. If, however, there's still no movement from there, the implication for a company, if you're not acting consistently with the guidelines, that could result in a complaint being made to a national contact point, which could be looking at things of what's the company's policies, what's happened in relation to remediation, if the company has caused or contributed to the impact itself, or also that question of leverage and influence. What's the company doing further along its supply chain or in its dealings with others? And the final point, again, a plug for the OECD Watch's materials. That's a really useful and important guide, I think, about thinking about complaints. Serena and everyone, sorry it was very quick, but I'll stop there and happy to join the further discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, John. And I appreciate, you have a lot of knowledge on these cases, and this was a really great snapshot that you've given. And I think to give participants a taste of cases, real cases. And so I appreciate you doing that work to draw out that case material. Just before we go to our question time, I'm just going to circle back to Frederick. Frederick, if you could just spend a couple of minutes sharing with us any sort of insights or reflections that you have in terms of, what you see on the ground. What are some of the challenges that Indigenous peoples face on the ground in trying to uphold their rights to self-determination and FPIC, particularly where businesses are involved? And that might be challenges for human rights defenders or others, but just if you could spend a few moments sharing with us some of your reflections and some of the suggestions of what can be done.
Yeah, thank you, Serena, once again, and thanks for Abby and John for your sharing. I think that's really useful knowledge for us. I will take opportunity first here is to reflect what is actually we can do together, and even the role of civil society, but also what is the advocacy path that we need to ensure, and later what will be the challenges that we have experienced. Definitely learning from the sharing of John as well, but what things that we should improve. I think this is something that I would like to share. I think the advocacy part that we always wanted to ensure is the ethics should be incorporated into the law, not only as a voluntary elective or a merit. So in the business or enterprises, we see emerging initiative at the global level and regional level. Let's say we have this national action plan on business and human rights, which is always referred to the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. But this is still the very voluntary in nature. But I think something that we also wanted to advocate with is the mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence, which is already, as John mentioned, already reflected in the OECD guideline, right? I think that's also avenue where we can cross check and intersect this collaboration whenever there's also discourse of business and human rights was discussed. And if you can go on next slide. And I think the representation is also always important that we need to also critically thinking, because not politically ascribed representativity should be aspired to, because sometimes even it's also the representation itself always refer to indigenous people, but maybe the indigenous people elites only, not really represent the affected community. This is often manipulated for us, and the recognition that consultation cannot and should not be regarded as a concern. This is we need to remind ourselves. Next. And I think this is also, I hope somehow also will respond the question in the chat box on the how civil society organization or human rights defender can play their important role. I think this also serving as the educational and advocacy tools for us to use this FPIC, to use the UN REIT, or also using the materials like OECD guideline, how we can localize those, right, with the community. I think this is something that we need to ensure so that we can ensure the bridge between the international norms and local reality. We are not talking very big, but somehow it's not connected to the local reality. So I think this is something that civil society, human rights defender, indigenous people itself also can work together and see. I bring one specific example. This is where Malaysia and also Indonesia already started and even expand to the Nepal. They have this indigenous community protocol. I think this is really the foundation on how community itself using the ethic as a guideline to negotiate the land use or to reject the harmful project without expecting what company interpret ethic about, what state interpret ethic about. But it's really how we govern our own territory with our norms, with our belief, cultural system within our own indigenous community protocol that we need to discuss together. Next. And I think this part of the challenges that maybe I also would like to share to everyone, but also to link with the John presentation. When we see the challenges part, for example, the OECD guideline. I've just talked recently with the one of the community that we are working with in Indonesia, the Pocok Leok community, which is affected by the nickel mining, right? They have exercised this OECD guideline, communicated with the NCP Korea, right? But I think the community itself still have a lack of knowledge or access. They are not aware with the mechanism, and they also see the remoteness of this mechanism or the complaint or grievance system itself as still seen as a centralized or open-based, or many of the things online option. But of course, community itself realize this is also the use of cost, right? And they also experience delay in response by the NCP. For example, this is Marine. We just talk what is really the progress, because we have exercised this year with this community because they are in the isolated area already. A lot of the territory already bulldozed, right? But I think we have tried this OECD guideline NCP, but yet still something that communication need to improve. But maybe this is also something that the Asia region also, because we see different country try to register, I mean, applying the OECD country, right? So I think this is also something that the improvement itself. And language and technical barriers, I think, still there. And we also see the threats and intimidation we need whenever we exercise this mechanism. Next. And I think this is the last part I'd like to say in terms of reflection of practical reality. I think we still see the mechanism itself bureaucrat or even still unclear within community. But I think this is something that we need to localize together. It's a civil society, human rights defenders, and we need to build the trust intermediary and legal and civil society aspect as well, and how we can also use the case able to exercise the existing mechanism like a national human rights institution or we have this well-being grievance mechanism, for example, but how we can ensure the community can able to participate fairly in this mechanism. Yeah, let me end here and thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much. Okay, I want to move to some questions. We did receive a number of questions prior to this, so I might jump to one of those questions we received in advance of this. It's a question that's come to us from Karat Malwaka, a human rights defender in Papua New Guinea, associated with the Porgera mine. And John, I might put this question to you. The question is, in really complex cases such as the Porgera mine, which has had, some really heinous violations associated with it involving land rights, but also some really serious human rights violations, abuse, killings, rapes, unlawful detentions. So is there any precedent where the Australian National Contact Point has facilitated remedy of that sort of nature, that's those really serious violations that can be caused by company operations?
Thanks, Serena. I guess the first point is it's never possible to remedy awful violations that you described. There's certainly some examples where there have been engagement with a company and facilitation and helping an agreement outcome. So the BHP, that 2009 BHP case I mentioned, another more recent example from the Australian National Contact Point, if you look up, and I'll put the link in the chat, ANZ and Cambodia, that was also a point where there was a financial payment or compensation paid in relation to those impacts. I guess the one thing important to recall, that the NCP process is not a judicial remedy mechanism, so it can't deliver an enforceable decision. You'll remember, if people were in the first webinar, I said that the best thing that it can do is help that engagement, and the only way the direct outcome will come from a company is if through that engagement, negotiation, facilitation, mediation, explaining why the guidelines apply and what they require, what they expect, can sometimes help the company get to a point where it will address some of those issues. If it doesn't, the only thing the NCP can do at the end is a statement to talk about consistency or otherwise. So in some respects, don't go to an NCP process thinking this of itself will provide all remedies. So, and that's, yeah, perhaps I would like to offer you a stronger and more positive response, but it has a part to play, I think.
That's right. And I think the point is that the OECD guidelines, it's just one of the tools in the toolbox that human rights defenders and advocates and NGOs can use. And it's not necessarily the right tool for every situation, but is useful as part of a broader advocacy strategy. Frederick, if I can go to you, there's a question in the chat function around, do you think we'll ever reach a point in time when FPIC changes and grows teeth, becomes more enforceable, so that it really does live up to its full potential?
Yeah, thanks, Serena. That is really an important question. I think the FPIC, in terms of the growing teeth to advance Indigenous peoples or not, I think this is something we need to reflect ourselves as an Indigenous people community. Because as an Indigenous people community, when we live in our community, what we need to live harmony with nature, right? And I think we should not really depending others on about how to grow the kit of FPIC, right? Because when we talk about the FPIC, it's always also referred to the recognition, which is the recognition of indigenous people, and it's still far to go, right? We see there's a trend of progress, let's say in ASEAN level. Just yesterday, we have observed they have adopted this ASEAN Declaration on a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Indigenous peoples advocate quite strong with no negotiation around recognition, around ethic, recognition about our cultural knowledge, traditional wisdom. Yet, when we see the final one, the adaptation paper, there's nothing at all mentioned there, right? Even they don't refer UNGP at all, right? Even they don't refer this OECD at all, or still far with the UN rate, right? So still a generic. And when we really understand what is that about, they also refer about the national sovereignty, or they also refer as security concern. So, like for us, we need to reflect as indigenous peoples. Do we want any kind of businesses or activity program that wanted to easily to destroy our territories, right? If this is something that we need to protect together, I think among the community itself also need to also work around their own unity, how to govern their territories without the interference from the different stakeholders, or without the interference from the state, or even from others outside the entity. But really how you can unite the community. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Important point about community solidarity, which is not necessarily always easy to get within communities either. John, a question that relates to a number of countries in our region. We see it in PNG, we see it in Malaysia, in Sabah. Are Chinese companies party to the OECD guidelines? And if not, what do you think communities can do to respond and push responsible business conduct when it's a Chinese company involved?
Yeah, thanks, Serena. So China is not an adhering country to the OECD guidelines, so there isn't a Chinese national contact point. But there's two things I would say are relevant. One is there's a thing called the Chinese due diligence guidelines in relation to mineral. I'll put the link up shortly. And essentially this is an agreement arrangement between the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct and Chinese minerals and metal producing companies, essentially to respect that due diligence process. That is mentioned a sort of a mediation complaints implementation process. There haven't been any cases yet, but that's one thing to keep in mind. I'll put the link up. But the second, probably the more relevant aspect to the guidelines is what's the supply chain? So there have been a number of cases where it said, okay, this isn't an issue directly of a Chinese company, but what the Chinese company is producing is perhaps being used in a product of a company from Norway or from Australia or from the US, Canada, wherever. And then the questions can be of that company, what's the due diligence you're doing on the supply chain? So if there's concerns, whether it's a Chinese company or any company, if there are questions of that supply chain, that there are human rights impacts further back, there are expectations on that company, whether it's US, Canadian, Australian, Chilean, whatever. So that's, there are many cases there where I think that would be the way I'd look at using the guidelines.
Yeah, it's a very important point, and it goes to the heart of another question. There's been a question with regards to, well, what is the role, if you like, of third parties, of auditors, for example, and just following on from John's point. So the guidelines apply to the multinational enterprise, but also all of their subcontractors and partners. So that could be used. So if, for example, you have a concern that an audit company or a financial institution that is supporting a project is part of or contributing to human rights violations or not upholding FPIC, then as John said, you can, if for example it was an auditor that was headquartered in Australia or a bank that was headquartered in Australia, then the complaint mechanism could be used for those companies. So thank you for that.
And sorry, just a quick one.
Sure.
I know I went very quickly in the slides, but the case, there's a case of compliance or a company that was involved in the certification over the Brumadinho Dam in Brazil, and questions over its actions. That was an NCP complaint. So yeah, there's some cases looking at those auditors or those technical supply companies and their connection with impacts.
Yes, indeed. Now, there was a question, Frederick, I might put that to you. Well, there's a couple of questions I'll roll together. One for you, Frederick. One is, well, how do companies actually prove that they've achieved or completed a genuine FPIC process? How can that actually be checked? And I guess it may have something to do with community involvement in the process, but also what do you think NGOs and impacted communities can do when they're really targeted for trying to, whether particularly human rights defenders are targeted in trying to uphold the rights of self-determination and FPIC?
Yes, thank you once again. I think, first of all, I would like to, for the company, I think the first step that they need to also do is they need to work around their policy, around the protection, even with the FPIC component. And we also see like Unilever have started one of the company that they have this good protection for the human rights defenders. I think this is one way, but under the practical situation, whenever involvement of the project, I think so far we don't see any, at least in our experience, we don't see any success. But I think there's a starting point where the company are started develop, more company are interested to develop the protection of human rights defender policies. I think this is one step. But in the ongoing discussion around the carbon market, which is also linked with the businesses operation, we've seen a lot of companies started to talk, communicate with this civil society. I think before any signing agreement, any document prepared to be implemented in the ground, I think this is one of the key to ensure, to consult how we can also deliver the FPIC, which is one for the indigenous community involvement, right? I think this is one really important. And then how they can be part of this process while doing all this FPIC consultation and what community really needs based on the project design. If they should also part of this or contribute to the discussion about the designing of the project and throughout the channel on the implementation. Yeah, and your second question, I think I missed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. John, I'll go to you. You maybe wanted to add something.
Thanks, Serena. I guess it just picks up that point Frederick was talking about protocols and representativeness. And one of the earlier questions in the chat of concerns about reprisals or safety of human rights defenders, and what occurs there. The guidelines very much emphasize that needs to be thought about in the NCP process, and many NCPs, the Australian among them, have say, reprisals or concerns about safety are important. And there can be ways in which complaints can be made where the identity of people who may be vulnerable or under threat can then be protected and not disclosed. And so there are ways in which that can occur. The key thing is to make sure if it gets to the point of a complaint being made, to demonstrate the authorization or the representation of why that complaint is appropriately made, and not just as the point Frederick and others said, it's not just an elite, not just one person saying, oh, well, I'm not happy with this. Provided you can demonstrate that process, that should be sufficient for the national contact point to say, yes, you have an appropriate interest in this, and it's appropriate to continue.
Thanks, John. And it actually leads just where you finished your final point then. It leads into another question that's been posed. In FPIC related specific instances, what threshold does the national contact point, or indeed you as an independent examiner, apply to accept a case for mediation?
Thanks, Serena. This one, to be quick, I'd refer back, have a look at the first webinar, and the links to the slides and the presentation are there. So the guidelines have a 6 criteria at the start, and essentially it's just a look, is there some substance? Is this an issue within the guidelines? If it is, then that's called accepted, and the offer or the proposal is made then for mediation. I see there's also a question about what interim measures can an NCP put in place. Well, that's very difficult. It's not, the NCP process is not a body or an institution that can enforce or put in measures itself. Some governments, when the process is finished, they will look at the NCP statement and they may say, well, if the NCP has said this company is not operated in good faith or is acting inconsistently with the guidelines, that may have other significance to that government. They may, withdraw consular assistance or other matters, but the guidelines don't set up the NCP as a enforcement mechanism or an enforcement body itself.
That's right. And just on that, I'll just add that one thing that is a little bit, again, different about the complaint mechanism of the OECD guidelines, to bring a case, you don't have to be directly impacted by the company conduct. So, for example, an NGO that is not living in that area, for example, can bring a case on behalf of impacted communities. So, whereas some other mechanisms, like the World Bank mechanisms, you in fact need to be directly impacted. And in our last minute, and this could be a stretch for you, John, but I'm sure you've got an opinion on it. So some of you may be aware that the European Union has developed a standard, the corporate sustainability directive on due diligence. So really taking as a mandatory measure on due diligence. And I guess the question is, how do you see that playing out potentially in Australia if a parent company is caught up by this EU directive, and then we've got the, FPIC challenges, for example, within Australia, an Australian project? Would that sort of cause, contribute, directly linked, indirectly linked framework apply?
Yep, it applies, and it gets back to the point, the guidelines, a number of cases say, whatever your domestic law says, that of itself does not prove consistency. So if your domestic law says you've got to do due diligence, maybe you need to do a report, part of that may help showing how you are consistent with the guidelines. But if that's also indicating actually there's an impact here that you've contributed to, if the domestic law, whether it's CS-DDD or the Australian modern slavery law, that might not say you have to remediate what you've found you've caused or contributed to, but it is an expectation of the guidelines. So there is the potential, if the company doesn't deal with that, there's the potential then of a complaint to the AusNCP and questions about, okay, company, how are you acting consistently with the guidelines? Because it's not apparent, and simply pointing to the law doesn't necessarily get you there.
Great. And just finally, look, we have tried to roll a number of questions that have been coming through into one. So I just was asked to do a quick whiz through the questions again. There was a question, I believe, from Nazir around that sort of implementation challenge, and I think we have addressed that with a number of responses. We're sure we've got the OECD guidelines, we've got UN declarations, but that's no guarantee necessarily that a company is going to do the right thing. But I think the responses from Frederick really stress the importance of, and also from Abby, about ensuring it's genuine, not just negotiation, but genuine engagement with Indigenous peoples. And then similarly, I guess the one other question that we haven't really touched on, and John, I'll ask you to respond very quickly. So what do the OECD guidelines apply, for example, in terms of government accountability when it's a state institution, state-run enterprise, and that enterprise, that state-run enterprise, state-owned enterprise, SOE, is not upholding FPIC and Indigenous peoples' rights?
Thanks, Serena. Yes, there are some examples. So it talks about multinational enterprises. So there have been a number of cases where it said, at the end of the day, there may be some government involvement, control, equity within this, but if it meets this idea of multinational enterprise, it still needs to meet the guidelines expectations. But perhaps more relevantly, the key thing is if a government, purely government agency is doing something that's causing impacts, the more important question is, are there any companies that are connected to that, either in supplying? So the Saab case is a good example. It wasn't Saab who used that equipment, it was the Australian military, but there's still appropriate questions of the company. What is your due diligence doing, because you have a link to that?
Thank you. Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. I'll just make a comment before I hand back to Kaya. I think it's just been a fabulous webinar, and I thank all of the speakers and participants for such great questions. I guess just a couple of points for me. A couple of points that really stood out, and is that the right to negotiate is very different to consent being given or withheld for a project, and I think Abby made that point very well, and also that genuine consent, and we had a number of questions about, well, how do you know if it's genuine? Was it real? Was it in good faith, etc.? And of course, it is a very complex issue, and there isn't always a shared view necessarily amongst all traditional owners and Indigenous leaders and Indigenous peoples with regards to a project. I think the other really salient point that we heard from a number from all the speakers really is that companies cannot rely on existing national legislation. And we certainly had a question in the chat about, well, what happens when companies are operating in jurisdiction that are corruption prone and have really weak governance? And the point being that it's not enough for a company to say, well, I was acting in accordance with those local laws, and particularly where those local law, the bar is very low. The expectations of the guidelines are that companies operate in accordance with the guidelines, regardless of what the national law is. And then there's just one other, my third point is really just to pick up on a point that Abby touched on, is just to remind everybody that FPIC is not a static process. It's not a one-off a one-off process. It's a very dynamic process, and it needs to be applied to each and every aspect of project development. And I guess the extractive sector is a salient example where consent may be given for one aspect of the project to proceed, but then when you get to a mine expansion phase, for example, it's not good enough. It's not appropriate for a company to say, well, we got consent way back when this project started, so job done. FPIC has to happen on an ongoing basis and at each and every stage of project development, from project inception right through to end of mine life. So I might leave it there and I'll hand back to Kaya and the DTP team. So thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking all the speakers.
Thank you so much, Serena. And yes, thank you to John, Frederick, and Abby for taking the time to speak at our webinar today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Serena for your wonderful job in really driving the webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time as well. Just to note, for this webinar, we will be sharing the recording and the slides, as well as all the links shared. We will also be uploading the recording to the DTP's YouTube channel, where you can access it as well as our DTP website. Just to note, we have 2 more webinars coming up in our Human Rights Defender series. One will be on the 6th of November and one will be on the 20th of November. So feel free to join us there. And I'd just like to thank all the participants today as well for their wonderful questions and insights. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your afternoon or midday, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.